I'm Emily Hillenbrand. I'm from CARE US, and this is my colleague, Salome Mhango, from CARE Malawi. We're really excited to be here, and I think this is a really interesting presentation of bringing together the research community with the practitioners and pairing us up. So our presentation this afternoon will try to bring some of the bottom-up practitioner perspective on the research that you've been talking about, Andrew, around behaviors and beliefs and how that affects uptake of not just agricultural practices, but other practices. With CARE, our central focus really is around gender and women's empowerment. That's kind of at the heart of what we do. So everything that's related with gender is really about addressing underlying beliefs and behaviors, and we try to have a gender transformative approach to our work. So what we'll present to you today is a bit of our working model around gender transformative agriculture, a model that we're calling the Farmer Field and Business School approach, is kind of the methodology for that model for agriculture. And a little bit about how we try to address those underlying beliefs and changing behaviors and practices around uptake of new technologies and ideas and behaviors. I'm sure that everyone here is familiar with the FAO State of Food and Agriculture report in 2011, which has those statistics around the disparities and the productivity gap and the gap in gender and agriculture, the various barriers that women face as farmers. We know that women play a very important role in smallholder agriculture, that they face numerous obstacles to being as productive and to profiting from their labor, and they have less access to financial services, to education, to markets, to extension information. They're burdened with multiple responsibilities at community, household, and market levels. We were looking for a picture of an overburdened farm woman, and it took Salome one phone call to her staff to go out and snap a picture of this woman who's obviously juggling multiple responsibilities, which is just an enormous burden. And although the data is scattered, and I'm sure Andrew has more data than we have, we know that these disadvantages do result in a significant gap in productivity and yields for smallholder farmers. And the statistic that is cited is that if women simply had the same access to productive resources as men, then they could increase their yields on their farms by about 20 to 30%, which would raise total agricultural output by 2.5 to 4%, which in turn would reduce the number of hungry people in the world by 12 to 17%. So it's a significant challenge, and it's an important issue to address. And what we also recognize and understand when working with a gender perspective is that underneath and behind all of those, women may have suboptimal practices on their farms, and they have very logical reasons for doing so. If they do not have tenure security, they're less willing to invest in those practices that may improve soil quality if they're not guaranteed to have access to that same plot the next year. Or if they need to work on their husband's plot first, they may not be able to plant their seeds on time. If they need to wait for someone else to purchase the seeds, they may not get the variety that they need, and so on. But also beneath each of these constraints, we know that there's a set of underlying beliefs. And this is just one problem tree exercise. It's not very easy to read. That we just did recently in Burundi. We were just trying to outline what are the obstacles and the challenges for women farmers in Burundi, and they listed a number. And then we took one of those, just women's land access, the problem of women not having access to quality land or control over quality land, and we just took each of these obstacles and went, why? Why is it that women have less access to land? Because they don't inherit it. And why don't they inherit it? Because it's given to the sons. And why is it given to the sons? Because the women are going to leave the home and get married, and so on until we get down to the bottom belief that women are considered to be the property of their husbands. So if you trace back all of these taken for granted practices, you get down to a root belief about gender and about the place of women in society. And their claims to property, to resources, to rights, to information, and so on. So these are some statements that came out of the baseline of this program that we're going to tell you about. Baseline beliefs about gender and about some of the constraints that women farmers face. And it comes down to these fundamental beliefs about women's place and their inferiority and their dependence. Women are underneath men because it's always been that way. If a woman works outside of the house, her husband will not be interested in her anymore. If a woman goes to the market, she may be perceived as consorting with men, and that can challenge the marriage. So underneath all of these suboptimal practices, we know that there are a lot of social logic and social constraints. And it's really important that we understand those in each context. So we have a cross-country program, and the beliefs tend to be of this similar nature across the programs, but they're also very contextually specific. So there's this whole range of constraints that are backed up by underlying gender norms and beliefs. That if we ignore those, then we might suppose that we might not understand the behaviors that people are practicing in their households and in their farms, and we might, from our perspective, see them as illogical or inefficient, suboptimal, but there is generally a social reasoning behind them. So in our work at CARE, we do try to apply a social norms approach to really try to address the underlying gender systems and structures and constraints. And really, we believe that if you don't address those deep-rooted beliefs about gender and gender inequality, then you're not actually going to finally change the fundamentals. You might touch the symptoms, but not the root causes. So the program that we'd like to talk to you about is called the Pathways to Empowerment Program, and it was developed out of research into our work across the care world, into what has worked to address some of the underlying constraints to women that women farmers face, and what are those common obstacles across the world in which we work. So we developed this theory of change that really tries to address, a lot of programs will intervene at the first level, or the first lever, or maybe the third level, really supposing that the key problem is lack of knowledge or lack of access to technologies. But we really see that it's a whole system, and we need to address these key constraints. So we have this theory of change that tries to look at applying interventions to these 5 key change levers, one being the capacity, including self-confidence, information, knowledge, but also that ability to apply what one has learned. We try to address the issues of the access to productive resources, both at the household level, at the market level, and the community level, including access to collective land for demonstration plots, and access to services and input and output markets. Productivity, of course, is through the demonstration farm model that we will explain a bit. And productivity also feeds into some of the changes around women's empowerment that you see. When women are more productive, they're bringing in more income. That does contribute to their perceived value in the household, which again gives them more confidence, more ability to access other resources and information, participate more in the community level. So it's kind of a positive cycle. But the key difference perhaps with our program is really placing a central and immediate focus on the household influence level, starting from the beginning and from the analysis of those power relationships within the household. How do they affect all of these other change levers? And how can we transform that relationship so that women can access these opportunities, participate more fully in decisions around agriculture and the household? And then underlying all of those is that enabling environment, which is not just the market structures and systems, but also the systems of belief and those social norms. So we do actively engage men, the spouses, other community leaders in trying to challenge and transform the institutions, but also those underlying beliefs and social norms that affect this whole picture. So we believe, or the hypothesis is that this is a virtuous cycle, that when you address that the productivity plays a key role in women's empowerment, but that it's also essential to address those gender norms and practices and beliefs in order to increase all of the other outcomes. Where's the next one? Okay. So Salome is going to tell you more about the Pathways program. But Pathways is our gender and agriculture multi-country program that, again, is kind of our platform for addressing gender constraints in the agriculture sector. And this is the methodology that we have developed as the key kind of mechanism for making these transformations. It's called the Farmer Field and Business School approach, which may not be the best acronym, but takes off from the Farmer Field School approach, of course. But it tries to specifically target women smallholder farmers to address that gap in access to extension information and services that exists in most of our contexts. But it also really tries to address the holistic nature of the problem and to recognize that women are not just farmers, but they have whole integrated lives, and that the extension model can try to address all of those key pieces of the agriculture system and their lived realities, essentially. So while the Farmer Field School approach really focuses just on that technology, or initially did at any rate, was somewhat top-down, a research innovation taken to the field. Let's test it out in a participatory way and see what works. We try to address the whole picture of integrating the key components of market literacy and market access, nutrition, so that people are not just producing more, but eating better quality diets and addressing that undernutrition problem. Obviously, the agriculture itself, the technologies and the best practices, and gender being fundamental to the model. And as a participatory approach, and one that really focuses on behavior change, the facilitation skills of those community-based trainers with whom we work is also integral to this model. You can't just message at people and expect them to take it up. It really, the way in which these technologies are tested and suggested is really critical. And participatory monitoring and evaluation. It's a very participatory model, as Salome will help to illustrate. And it's really based around adult learning principles, learning by doing in all aspects, whether it's cooking demonstrations that are done at the community level in a participatory way, whether it's the gender sessions, which are also based on some of these PRA tools and role plays and that demonstrate the disparities as they are, and then ask people to identify solutions that can work for them. Or whether it's the participatory analysis of the program itself, of the yields, of the different treatments, of what works for them and what they want to adopt or not. And again, recognizing the busyness and the reality of women's lives, another key feature of this model is the way that it's integrated throughout the agricultural calendar. So this is FFBS begins with the community getting together and mapping out the key steps in the agricultural calendar, and then trying to identify when does it make sense to have this or that nutrition or gender session, when do people have more time, when can we do community things, where do we need to do things on the farm, where does it make most sense to people's lives and people's calendars. So really trying to respect women's priorities as farmers, and that cannot change, and also to make it work for the communities that we're working with. So I think in the afternoon, afterwards, we have an activity to help kind of map out that integrated calendar that you can also help us with. So I'm going to hand it over to Salome, and she'll tell you more about what it actually looks like in practice.
So thank you so much, Emily. Are you able to hear me? Okay. Is it better now? Okay. So I'm taking from where Emily stopped to talk about the Farmer Field and Business School, which is a learning by doing approach. I'll start by explaining a few pictures that we have in this slide. They are not looking very nice, but they will help to take us further along in our discussion. So in the first picture, you basically see a woman who is doing some processing, and in the second picture, you have a group of women who are doing some exercise. In the third one, you have a group of farmers who are in a demo plot and trying to learn some agriculture practices. And in the fourth picture, you have you have two women who are planning a farming calendar around the FFBS methodology. So the FFBS methodology it focuses on learning by doing, thereby mitigating risks and trying out new practices as a group. So the starting point is that the group will identify their issues and needs, and using a calendar, they plan around how they could deal with the issues that they have identified. Okay, so to talk about beliefs and behaviors, I will be using a lot of examples to demonstrate how farmers and women especially decide to pick on some innovations and leave out others. I would try by illustrating with the ridging. I don't know if many of us have seen a ridge before. So a ridge is when you want to grow your crops, maize, soya, whatever. In Malawi, you till the soil and make a heap. You plant the crops on top of that heap. It takes a lot of time to make that heap, and you lose a lot of energy as you are doing that. But that practice has been there since 50 years ago. When the colonial government was there, they were teaching us that for us to make productive gains in farming, we don't need to plant on bare land, we have to make ridges. So it was enforced, and everyone in Malawi does the ridging. However, when you look at the practice, as I've said, it's very intensive, and now the efforts are shifting. People know that it's not beneficial in any way, it's just draining the energy, and they are trying to put up some practices which would reduce the labor burden for farmers. But it's not easy, because they've been doing this for 50 years, and it's a behavior, it's a belief that they cannot just change overnight. So in the Pathways program, we are doing 3 treatments. The first treatment, which is the best one, is where we are encouraging our farmers to do no ridges. They will just do like minimum tillage maybe in the first year, and then we encourage them to manure the soil and mulch it with some grass or maize stalks. And then the subsequent years, they just plant. The other treatment that we are doing is, we know some farmers are very resistant, so they still want to keep their ridges, but we encourage them to just manure on one side. So by doing that, we are reducing the labor as compared to the third treatment, which is a traditional way, where basically what they will do is they will make a ridge open a trench in the middle, manure it and cover it. So it's like the same ridge, you are doing work on it 4 times. So by using variants like this, we allow women to make a decision on what best practice, what kind of behavior they should adopt. So what we are seeing now is that some farmers are choosing either the first or the second, but a lot of farmers are still doing the third one. I think my colleague who has been to Malawi several times, you keep on seeing these ridges, even though people know that they are very labor intensive. And in terms of time savings, for the first treatment, you actually reduce the labor from, like you save, instead of taking 90 days, you take 8 days. So those are some of the trials that we do in the demonstration plots so that our farmers can make informed choices. And the same with Ghana, where they are also implementing the same program. They are also doing a number of treatments around soybean growing. So in our marketing component, one of the activities that our farmers are doing is basically to cost out the additional investment costs by comparing, the additional treatments, and from there make like informed choices. So in Ghana, they were doing 5 treatments, as you can see there. And for each of those treatments, they were able to collect information on the yield per kilogram, the cost, the added returns, and the percentage increase in earnings. And as you can see with the data, they were able to establish that where they had applied no fertilizer, they managed to harvest 1,167 kilograms per hectare. And where they had Activa, they managed to harvest 2,218 kilograms per hectare. But when you look at the cost, you see now that comparing the two treatments, they have a cost of 315 and the added returns is 736, and resulting in increase in earnings of 113%. So the other treatments, you can also see the same pattern. They have costs in it. But I want us to focus on the last treatment, which is inoculant only, where the yield per hectare is 1,570 kilograms. The cost of production is 35. The added return is 368, and percentage increase is 951%. So when farmers do collect this kind of data, it helps them to make decisions on what kind of practice to adopt. So in this case, our Ghana farmers have decided to adopt the inoculant only, because even though it yields lower compared to the Activa, you can see that in terms of the cost that they will make to produce the soybean is far much less. I'll also talk about our experiences in nutrition. Emily talked about us doing a number of activities in nutrition, some of which are around helping farmers to cook nutritious dishes in what we call cooking demonstrations. So these are like public ceremonies where men and women come together and try out new recipes using the crops that the program has introduced or crops that are locally available in the community. So this approach is better for us because instead of just telling people that soya is nutritious, you actually give them an opportunity to learn and experiment on the type of recipes, the taste, and the cultural dishes that they can make out of the crop. And at the same time, it's also an occasion for men and women to come together and demonstrate new gender behaviors. If you can look in that picture, the first one, you see that there is a man and women working together. From the communities that we are working, Ghana and Malawi, that is not a common behavior. But because the program is the one that has organized such an event, you see that men and women come together and do things which culturally are not acceptable. And the other things that we see as people do these cookery demonstrations and other nutrition activities is that people start to adopt start to adopt positive nutritional behaviors. For example, we see that now men and women eat together. From the community that I'm coming from, men will eat on their own and women will eat on their own. And mostly it's the men who eat the better foods. So for example, if it's a chicken that day, maybe the women will eat the lesser important parts and the men will eat good ones. But with these sessions, we encourage men and women and their children to eat together, and as such they share the food equally and get the nutritional benefits as required. We also, under the nutrition component, educate the farmers not to sell all the produce that they are harvesting from their farms. So like soya is, apart from being a source of income, it's also a good source of nutrition for children and the family as a whole. So we encourage that they should do food budgeting and make sure that they reserve enough for their homes. I already talked about trying out new recipes, and the men doing the shows that normally they wouldn't do maybe in a home setting. But because the program is there spearheading these behaviors, we see that there is uptake in those behaviors also. Around gender, we are also doing a lot of work. Our emphasis is basically to promote uptake of gender practices that will move our farmers towards gender equality. Because we believe that yes, you can give people a plot of land or seed, but if in terms of gender they are not speaking to each other very well, you may not achieve the results that you intended to achieve. So in this slide, basically what is happening is that like in the picture that is under there, it's actually a gender dialogue session taking place. So for us to talk about the gender issues, we use gender dialogues, and to really make the message sink, we do use tools such as role play. So here they are acting out a role play to talk about some of the gender practices in their communities. And sometimes we also use games like football matches. We also use a lot of PRA tools to demonstrate on the problems around gender that are affecting agriculture productivity and the other issues as a whole. And each dialogue session ends with a discussion on the practical actions that the communities can take. So we define with the communities themselves to say what are the easier steps that you can take after going through this gender dialogue, or what are the tougher, hard to take decisions that you think you would engage in. And after that discussion as a team, we meet and we agree on, what are the easy, progressive, visible behaviors, and where do these communities or the farmers need support to really take on the more challenging behaviors. So on the right, we have a marker. So that marker is basically a mountain. When we do our gender dialogues and all the gender activities that we have planned in our program, there are certain behaviors that we agree with the communities that for us really to say that things have changed, this is what we'll do. For example, men can say, we'll be helping our wives with the household chores. And women would say, we'll start to ask support for our husbands to help us with household chores. So we do come up with a number of progressive steps, which we call progress markers. So with the communities, we sit down and discuss. There can be maybe 30, 15 to 20 progress markers that you have identified. But within those progress markers, you engage in a discussion and say which changes are easier to make. So for example, they will say, cooking while my wife is away is an easier practice for me to undertake. So that one, we'll put it down where we have said expect to see, because it's a change that normally you expect to to happen in a home. But there are other changes, like maybe a man would say, I can cook when my wife is away, but it would be very difficult for me to cook when my wife is around. So for us, that kind of behavior is not very easy, because not many men would want to be observed while, cooking while maybe their wives is sitting around watching. So that kind of behavior might go up. It means that it is achievable, but slightly difficult to achieve. And then there are also other practices or actions that are very hard to achieve. For example, for women to negotiate for land, to say that this piece of land I really want to be growing my own crops, may not be easy in our setting. So that becomes a love to see behavior. When we reach that change, when we reach that level, we know that we have managed to achieve our objectives, which in this case we call them outcome challenges. So the other element that we do in this program is around participatory monitoring and evaluation, and Emily will take it from there.
I can just go back to this one for a second. We drew a lot on outcome mapping methodology. Those of you who are familiar with it will recognize the terminology. And it really helped us to translate this abstract idea of gender equality, women's empowerment into specific behaviors, because outcome mapping actually defines outcomes as changes in behaviors. So it helped us to identify to what extent is change happening and how progressive or how transformative is that change. So this picture, sorry, it's very hard to see, but it's a picture of men preparing coffee in Ethiopia. And they would be pointing to these examples as saying, look how much progress we've made. There's men fetching firewood, making coffee all over the place. We've done our job. But when we did this outcome mapping process, we looked at what would women's empowerment, gender equality, really equitably engaged men look like if we had achieved everything that we want to achieve, and we define that in a very visual picture, behavior specific picture, and then they helped to identify what are the steps along that way that show that we're kind of making progress toward that. So as it turns out, men making coffee falls pretty far down the mountain. It's kind of one of those early expect to see changes. So this helps us to kind of recognize and congratulate and applaud progress that we are making, while also helping to keep people moving kind of up towards more transformative changes. So that participatory monitoring and evaluation is integral to this whole participatory approach. It's a very empowering process, and we find that it's not just a way of monitoring, but it really also is a process that can help encourage the adoption of new behaviors and practices. So one of the tools that we use for measuring adoption of new practices in agriculture and marketing behaviors is this tool we call the Participatory Performance Tracker. And it's done at the group level twice a season, the mid and end of season. And for all of those ideal recommended practices are laid out. And as you can see at the top of the page, I think, the chart has the ideal practices. And then each individual within that group will go through and we ask who was able to apply fertilizer this season. And they get an individual yes or no. And then you can discuss why and why not, and who was able to and who wasn't. And then if there's more information needed, then the field agent can also provide some more information, but also to identify what are those constraints. And then there's kind of a group pressure and support mechanism as well. So women have an opportunity to kind of encourage each other and to share their own experiences and how they were able to adopt or not adopt practices. So they're given an individual score, but also the groups themselves, which groups are collectively doing better at adoption of these practices. And there's also a group PPT which addresses their collective strength. So how well are they doing as a group at accessing markets, at being able to negotiate directly with buyers, access resources, and that also gives us a sense of their sustainability. So there's also a score for the groups on how their readiness to graduate, essentially, and to rely less on support from the program and to be able to function more independently. So that is a pretty straightforward tool that, again, that helps us to track uptake and focus our attention on those groups that are doing less well, to make better use of our program resources, but it also is a tool that helps to encourage behavior changes at the same time. And we've applied the same approach to our gender behaviors. So we have mapped out what progress looks like in terms of specific doable gender behaviors. And this, we have context-specific behaviors. So each of the behaviors in our 5 countries are different, but we have 5 common categories of change. And we have a set of progress markers for men and for women. And the categories are around workload sharing, decision-making and communication within the household, access or sharing resources. What's the other? What's that? Yes. The fourth one is, for women, it's around self-confidence, autonomy, and leadership. And for men, it's about role modeling, equitable behaviors, maybe demonstrating these role model behaviors in public. And then a 5th category that doesn't come up on most of your agricultural measurement tools is a category around intimacy and harmony in the relationship, which turned out to be a very important category of change for people that's both resulting from and helps to encourage some of the positive changes that are happening at the household level. So this category is from category 4 for women, which is around self-confidence and autonomy. And you can see these are the key behaviors. They're from expect to love to see. So there's a progression. So women dressing nicely and looking good was an indicator of self-confidence as well as kind of control over income for them. And that turns out to be an early change, an early behavior change. Whereas women publicly speaking out against gender-based violence would be one of those love to see changes. And so we're able to mark, using that same group monitoring process, to what extent is this happening in your community? Do you see this happening not at all or quite a lot? So again, these are really opportunities for behavior change as well as monitoring progress, because through that process of dialogue, you're creating that space for people to talk about these issues. And I just came from a visit to Malawi, where you just see this remarkable change in people very openly talking about gender-based violence, about extramarital affairs, and doing so in a way that had a lot of laughter and a lot of really free debate that in itself is a really remarkable change. And just by creating that space and allowing people to raise the topic, you had people coming up and saying, I've been, wanting to talk about this for years and years, and I've never had the occasion to do so before. And so that in itself can kind of promote some of the changes that we're looking for. So if we had to kind of summarize our own reflections around what we've observed and learned from our program about the processes of behavior change and adoption of new practices, we can say that it's a calculation, it's a constant calculation of cost and benefit, and that includes social costs and some intangible benefits that might not be obvious to people outside of that given community. And it's really important to understand what people value and what's important to them and what the risks are for trying new practices, whether it's gender, nutrition, or agriculture. So one woman told us, for example, that she chose to join the VSLA group because she saw these women dressing nicely and looking smart in their matching wrappers, and that was what inspired her to go find out what was going on in that group and gave her the courage to go check it out and finally join. And some of the men, again from Malawi, told us some of them had started participating in some of these meetings, and they saw that there was a benefit that spilled over these exercises around communication and dialogue had a benefit on what went on in the bedroom. And that's what they were telling other men, that there's this benefit. If you come join a group, you will benefit from it. And so that brought in a lot of other men to these group dialogues. And in turn, the women told us that men who participate in these groups are using less violence in the household. So it kind of has an interesting interlinked effect. But that is a really important dimension to people, obviously, the relationship. It's not something that we usually talk about in agriculture programming, but that is, where people spend their lives. And it's also really important to understand the social risks and the costs of adopting some of these new behaviors. So with this participatory monitoring process, we also understand the backlash that is raised against women who seem to be too empowered, for example, or for men who try cooking in public and get laughed at or told that their wife has bewitched them. So it's important to also understand those risks so that we can tailor the program and come up with new dialogues as needed, or take actions that can help to mitigate that risk, or to talk about it in public and just to create more spaces for those conversations. And it's also really important to understand, particularly at the beginning, kind of the precariousness of women's situations, the very little negotiation room that they have with the relationships that they have to manage within the household, and not having assets, risking violence. It gives you very little room to speak up. But we've also found that when they do have capacity and knowledge, assets, income in their hands, it's a little bit harder to push them around. So that does feed into this virtuous cycle of empowerment and greater voice within the household. So behavior change is more likely to happen when people can develop and test their own treatments. Again, whether it's the gender practices or the agricultural practices, it starts from the basis of a problem analysis. What is it that is a challenge? What is it that we want to work on? And what are the treatments that we want to try in the field? What are the marketing challenges that people face? What are the gender problems that are most pressing? And then when people can practice their own treatments, of course, they're going to be much more interested and willing to experiment with them. And let's see. Yeah. So these profound social changes are not immediate, but they still are measurable, is what we have found as well. Again, with the gender, we know it's a long-term process, but if you can break it down and kind of identify the progression, we can see at least in which direction change is going. Again, it can be encouraged through that group reflection process. And I think what's very important as well is breaking it down into context-specific and doable practices, particularly around the gender and the nutrition, but as well as the agricultural practices, obviously. I think, if you draw from the behavior change communication lessons of the nutrition field, or ask any nutritionist who's working with someone newly diagnosed with diabetes. If you tell them they need to start running half an hour 3 days a week, completely change their regime, it's going to be overwhelming. But if you say, can you walk around the block twice after you get home from work and figure out what's the small action you can take, then it's less overwhelming, there's less resistance, and there's more willingness to kind of try and figure out the the solutions that work. And then I think as people see changes happening around them, then they can also follow those earlier adopters and see the benefits and be more convinced. So I think probably drawing more from that behavior change literature would be informative for us as well. And I'm going to give it to Salome for the last word, but I think what we have observed is that when you have this integrated, holistic program, you get really holistic results, and there's a really important interrelation between the gender changes and the gender activities and the other outcomes. And it's not just the income that makes the difference, but it's really this package that seems to help.
So I think the last statement on this slide says addressing the gender beliefs multiplies the impact of agriculture productivity and income benefits. That's true, but I think I have two questions. Where do the practitioners and the research people meet so that they can design programs that are holistic in nature, like pathways? Most of the times we do focus on maybe promoting one kind of innovation, and we forget that we are working with people who do not look at an intervention in isolation, but they look, at the benefits in totality. So my question is, how can we create forums where we can bring together the research and the practice piece so that we develop innovations that will be palatable for the people that we are working with? The other observation that I have is around participation. Yes, we can have good innovations, good technologies that we are trying to put across, but if we don't work with the people who we think will adopt the technologies itself, I don't know how successful would be in terms of adoption, because we really don't understand from their side of story why they would want that kind of innovation. So maybe we need to work more in partnership, and we need to get the voice of the people at the bottom level, so that we design technologies, we put up innovations that will best suit their needs. Thank you.